The Kithrani salvage vessel drifting wage had been combing the Perseus Rim for 3 years, scavenging the bones of long-dead civilizations for anything that could be sold, melted down, or reverse-engineered. Captain Vethik Orso had seen wrecks before, broken husks of empires that burned out millennia ago, but nothing like this. The object drifting in the debris field beyond the dead star Keswick 9 was no wreck. It was intact, 3 kilometers of dark hole unscarred by time, its surface pattern with symbols no scanner in Kithrani space could translate. No power signature, no heat, no life, just silence and a hole that drank up every sensor pulse they threw at it like it didn't want to be seen. Vethik's crew called it a ghost hull, ancient, derelict, abandoned, the kind of find that made careers. He ordered a boarding team of 6. Standard procedure: cut in, map the interior, tag anything valuable, get out before the insurance windows closed. What they found inside unsettled even the company's most hardened scavengers. Corridors too large for any known species. Murals depicting wars fought across galaxies the Kithrani had never charted. And at the heart of the ship, 11,000 sealed cryopods, each one humming faintly, not dead, not powered down, dormant. Junior Tech Yarsel Ember ran her scanner over the nearest pod and found something that made her hands shake. A heartbeat, slow, patient, waiting. "Captain," she said into her calm, voice tight, "these things are alive." Vethik didn't believe her until he saw it himself. The faint rise and fall of a chest beneath frost-rimed glass. A face that looked disturbingly, uncannily human, not an alien species he recognized. Something that looked like it belonged in old myths. Myths every spacefaring culture told about the war that ended an age, about a species so violent the galaxy conspired to bury them and forget. He'd heard the legends, everyone had, the burned ones, the silent plague, the species that fought a war so total that surviving civilizations agreed never to speak its name lest it remember it existed. Vethik told himself it was superstition, old spacer ghost stories. He ordered his team to begin extraction. These pods alone would be worth more than every salvage run he'd ever made combined. Live specimens, functioning ancient technology. This was the find of a lifetime. He didn't notice the ship's interior lights beginning, almost imperceptibly, to warm. He didn't notice the soft click of a single pod seal beginning to disengage 3 decks below his boarding team, completely unprompted by anything they'd touched. Something on this ship had heard them, had heard the word human spoken in translation by his own soothsay parsing the mural's ancient text. And after 10,000 years of silence, something deep within the dark hull had just opened one eye. Yarsalimbe was alone in Cryo Bay 4 when the pod in front of her hissed. She'd been cataloging serial numbers, bored, half listening to Vethik argue with corporate over the comm about extraction rights, when the frost on pod 14 cracked down the middle like a spider web. She stumbled back, scanner clattering to the floor as the seal released with a pressurized gasp and pale vapor rolled out across her boots. She should have run. Instead, she watched. The woman inside, and it was unmistakably a woman, dark-haired, scarred along one collarbone in a way that told a story Yarsel couldn't read, didn't lurch away gasping like in the holodramas. She opened her eyes calmly, focused them, found Yarsel standing 6 feet away in an unfamiliar void suit and didn't flinch. "Position," the woman said, voice rough from a decade or a millennium of disuse. "Ship status report." Yarsel didn't understand the language, but her suit's translator caught up half a second later, garbling the words into Kithrani trade tongue. "Position, ship status, report." It wasn't a question born of fear. It was a question born of protocol, like waking up was simply the next item on a checklist. You're not supposed to be awake," Yarsel stammered, backing toward the bay door. This ship was derelict, abandoned, dead. The woman sat up, joints moving with the stiff precision of someone running a self-diagnostic rather than recovering from cryoshock. She looked around the bay, really looked, taking in the cut marks on the bulkhead where Vethic's team had forced entry, the floodlights that weren't hers, the unfamiliar insignia on Yarsel's suit. How long? The woman said. Not what year is it, not panic, just how long. Yarsel's translator hesitated on the number when she finally checked her wrist console because the ship's internal chronometer had just sensed and spat out a figure that made her own throat go dry. 10,143 years, Yarsel whispered. For the first time, something flickered across the woman's face. Not fear, something colder, something that looked unsettlingly like relief. Good, the woman said. Long enough. She swung her legs off the pod's edge and stood, testing her balance, rolling her shoulders. Behind her, down the long row of cryobays stretching into the dark, Yarsel heard it, pod after pod beginning to crack and hiss in sequence, a wave of sound rolling away from pod 14 like a struck bell. Wake the others, the woman said, not to Yarsel, but to the ship itself, to some system Yarsel couldn't see. A calm female voice, ancient and patient, answered from speakers Yarsel hadn't even known were active. Acknowledged, Commander. Waking Command Crew Manifest. Welcome back, Captain Reyes. Yarsel ran. She didn't stop running until she reached the airlock, screaming into her comm for Vethic to evacuate the ship immediately. And behind her in the dark, 11,000 pods continued to open one by one like a held breath finally being released. Captain Alina Reyes had exactly 4 minutes of disorientation before her training took over completely. And even those 4 minutes were spent productively, assessing threats, cataloging unfamiliar tech, calculating odds. By minute 5, she was walking the corridor toward the bridge with the easy, dangerous confidence of someone who had done this exact thing. Wake up in the dark not knowing what she'd find more times than she cared to remember. The ship's AI, designated Meridian, briefed her in clipped bursts as she walked. Hull integrity, 94%. Weapon systems, dormant awaiting authorization. Crew revival, 11,212 of 11,212 in progress. External breach detected. Deck 7. Unauthorized clears throat entry. 6 individuals. Species unknown. No records in archive. Define no records. Alina said. The species accessing this vessel does not match any database entry from before cryosleep initiated. They are new to us, Captain. We have been asleep a very long time. How long? 10,143 years, Earth Standard. Alina didn't stop walking, but something in her chest went very still. 10,000 years. Long enough for empires to rise and die. Long enough for whoever had won the war that had forced her crew into this ship, into this sleep in the first place, to have built monuments to their victory, written histories that didn't mention humanity at all, except maybe as a cautionary footnote. A ghost story. Good. She told the frightened alien tech in the cryobay, and she'd meant it. Because if 10,000 years had passed and humanity was still considered dangerous enough to bury and forget, still spoken of, even as myth, then the thing she'd been ordered to protect was still safe. The thing that mattered more than her life, more than her crew's lives, more than the war itself. She reached the bridge. It lit up around her, screens blooming to life one by one, displaying constellations that had drifted out of recognition, star charts that needed updating, and one steady blinking icon in the corner that had never once gone dark in 10,000 years. A single sealed vault status deep in the ship's core. Secure. Whatever the Keithrani Meridian had already tagged the intruder's species from a recovered comm burst. Whatever they thought they'd found, they had no idea. They hadn't found a derelict warship. They'd found a tomb that refused to stay closed, crewed by the one species the galaxy had agreed to forget out of fear, guarding a secret that was worth waking an army for. Alina Reyes sat in the command chair for the first time in 10 millennia and felt it mulled to her like it had been waiting. Meridian, she said quietly, Tell me everything that's happened since we went under. And then get me Commander Okafor. We have intruders to talk to and a war to find out the ending of. Vethik Orso had run 3 combat tours before he turned to salvage work, and every instinct from those years was screaming at him to flee the drifting wage and torch the jump coordinates from his ship's memory. Corporate wouldn't let him. Corporate had heard live ancient humans and intact warship technology in the same sentence and immediately stopped caring about his survival instincts. So he stood on his own bridge sweating while a hologram resolved in the center of the room. A woman in a worn gray uniform standing with a kind of stillness that made his skin crawl because nothing about her suggested fear. Captain Vethik Orso, she said before he'd even introduced himself. His translator caught up half a second later. She'd pulled his name from his own ship's outgoing comm signature in under a minute. I'm Captain Alina Reyes, Commanding Officer UES Tantalus. You're trespassing on a sovereign vessel. I'd like you to leave my crew member at the airlock and depart. This is salvage rights, Vethik said, falling back on the only script he had. Your vessel was derelict, he had. Your vessel was derelict. No power signature, no life signs, no claim filed in any registry. We were asleep. Alina said, not dead. There's a difference. And under the Geneva Compact she paused, visibly recalculating. Under any compact your people might recognize regarding the rights of sovereign crewed vessels. Boarding an occupied ship without consent is an act of war. The word landed in the room like a dropped weight. Vethik's weapons officer shifted uneasily at her station. We didn't know you were occupied, Vethik said carefully. We can discuss compensation. Salvage fees. A finder's arrangement. I don't want your money, Captain. Alina's voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. I want to know what year it is, what's happened to Earth, and why your species has apparently never heard of mine. Because either we're much further from home than I think, or something has gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody remembers we existed. Vethik glanced at his first officer, who shook her head almost imperceptibly. Don't. But Vethik had 3 combat tours of instinct telling him that lying to this woman would be far more dangerous than telling her the truth. There are stories, he admitted, old ones about a species that fought a war so total it ended in age. The burned ones, the silent plague. Civilization agreed never to speak the name because he hesitated. Because some believed naming you would wake you up, he said. It seems they were right to worrying. For the first time Alina Reyes almost smiled, though there was nothing warm in it. 10,000 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and we're still the boogeyman. She looked back at him. Captain Orso, I'm going to need you to take me somewhere with a working comm relay to the rest of galactic civilization. I have some catching up to do, and you're about to become very, very famous for better or worse. Relay station at Ketham Prime had never processed a request like the one Veth submitted, and the bureaucratic shockwave it caused rippled outward faster than any of them anticipated. Within 6 hours, 3 separate galactic powers had dispatched ships to Keswick 9. Within 12, the Vellum car unconquered, the closest thing the galaxy had to a unified government, had convened an emergency session, and Captain Alina Reyes found herself, via hologram, addressing a council chamber of 17 species who had spent 10,000 years building an entire civilization around the explicit assumption that her people were extinct. She watched their reactions as Meridian translated her words in real time, and she catalogued every flicker of fear, fascination, and barely concealed horror with the same cold precision she'd once used to read enemy formations. An elder of the Thessic communion, insectoid, ancient, draped in ceremonial chains denoting scholarly rank, was the one who finally said what the others were too careful to voice. You understand, the elder said, mandibles clicking with what her translator rendered as deep unease, that your species is not remembered as a footnote. You are remembered as a cautionary structure, an organizing principle. There are entire schools of philosophy, entire branches of galactic law built around the question of what must never be allowed to happen again. And what must never be allowed to happen again is you. Then tell me what we did. Alina said, because my last clear memory is a war that wasn't going our way. In order to evacuate critical personnel and assets, and 10,000 years of silence afterward. I don't know what you think we are. I'd like to know what we actually were. The chamber went very quiet. Then the elder told her, haltingly, carefully, like someone describing a wound that had scarred over wrong, about the Concordance War, about a species that arrived in galactic space already fighting amongst itself, and somehow turned that internal violence outward when threatened, with an adaptability and ferocity that broke 3 separate alliance fleets before anyone understood what they were facing, about a war that ended not because humanity lost, but because humanity stopped, vanished mid-campaign, ships and fleets simply gone, as if some unseen hand had pulled them off the board entirely. You won, the elder said simply, and then you disappeared. We have spent 10,000 years wondering if you were retreating, regrouping, or simply waiting. Now I imagine we have our answer. Alina absorbed that in silence, feeling the full, terrible weight of it settle onto her shoulders, and onto the shoulders of 11,000 crew members who had gone to sleep believing they were losing a desperate war, only to wake up as the monster under an entire galaxy's bed. We weren't waiting, she said finally. We were guarding something, and I think it's time I found out if it's still worth guarding. Meridian had kept the secret for 10,000 years without a single lapse, and even now, briefing Alina privately in the dim quiet of her ready room, the AIS voice carried the careful precision of something built to protect a truth at any cost. The vault was sealed under Continuity Protocol 12, Meridian said, on direct order of Earth's Unified Command, 11 days before the Tantalus and the rest of the Ark fleet departed. You were not briefed on its contents before cryosleep, Captain. Few were. The order was explicit. The vault opens only for a commanding officer of the Tantalus, only after confirmed contact with the wider galaxy, and only when that officer judges humanity's situation stable enough to bear what's inside. That's a very specific set of conditions for an AI guarding for 10 millennia, Alina said. I had excellent motivation, Meridian replied, and there was something almost dry in the AIS tone. The vault is the reason the Ark fleet exists at all, Captain. It's the reason 11,000 of your people were placed in cryosleep and scattered to the edges of known space rather than dying on Earth with the rest. Alina's stomach tightened. The rest. Earth's surface population did not survive the war's final years, Meridian said, with the gentleness of an AI that had clearly rehearsed this disclosure 10,000 times in its processing cycles and never found an easier way to say it. Unified Command's final act was to disperse what could be saved: genetic libraries, cultural archives, key personnel, and the contents of this vault across a dozen Ark vessels, of which the Tantalus is one. I do not know the fate of the others. I have had no contact since departure. The floor of Alina's certainty already cracking gave way entirely. She had woken up grieving a war she thought she might still be losing. Now she understood she'd been asleep through the actual loss, the unthinkable one, and the only thing standing between humanity's complete extinction and whatever came next was sealed behind a door she hadn't yet opened. Take me there, she said. The vault sat in the ship's deepest core behind 3 meters of alloy that Keith Roney's scanners hadn't even been able to penetrate. Meridian's voice authenticated her, and the door split open with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, rows of stasis cylinders smaller than the cryopods above, each one humming with quiet patient life support. Through the frosted glass of the nearest, Alina could just make out a small sleeping shape. Soft-featured, peaceful, utterly unaware of the 10,000 years that had passed. Children, hundreds of them, the last unbroken thread of humanity's future, sealed in the dark waiting for someone to decide the galaxy was finally safe enough to wake them. Alina Reyes stood in the silence of the vault and for the first time since opening her eyes in Cryo Bay 4, allowed herself to cry. News of the vault did not stay contained. Vethix's corporate handlers leaked enough of it to galactic media within a day that the Velcare Unconquered convened a second emergency session. This one considerably less composed than the first. The chamber split almost instantly into two furious camps. One, led by a coalition of military-minded species who remembered the Concordance War through the lens of their own shattered fleets, argued that humanity's cautionary structure status existed for good reason and that an awakened Ark fleet with children aboard, who would grow up to inherit whatever ferocity had made humanity so devastating, represented an existential risk that needed to be contained, quarantined, or worse. The other camp, smaller but unexpectedly vocal, was led by the Theisic Elder who had spoken with Alina directly. They argued that a species capable of ending a war by simply choosing to stop, by prioritizing the survival of its children over the completion of a victory, was not the monster the old stories described. That 10,000 years of myth-making had flattened a desperate grieving people into a fairy tale, and the galaxy owed it to itself and to humanity to find out which version was true. Alina Reyes was asked to speak to the Chamber of Final Time before any vote was taken, and this time she came prepared. "You spent 10,000 years," she said, "building philosophy and law around the idea of what humanity might do if we ever woke up. I'd like to offer you something better than a guess. Open contact, full transparency. I will submit the Tantalus and every soul aboard her, combat crew and children alike, to whatever verification, observation, or oversight this council deems necessary. Not because I think you have the right to demand it, but because I think it's the only way either of us ever stops being afraid of the other. And if the council votes for containment regardless," the military coalition's lead representative asked, "if we decide the risk outweighs the gesture." Alina's expression didn't change, but Meridian, monitoring her vitals from the bridge, noted a very slight, very deliberate steadying of her breath, the same one logged in her file from before the war, in the seconds before every engagement she'd ever survived. "Then you should know," she said quietly, "that this ship alone broke 3 of your Alliance fleets before we ever stood down. We chose to stop fighting. We did not lose the ability to. I would prefer this go differently than the last time someone tried to decide humanity's fate without asking us first, but the choice on that point is only yours." The chamber went silent. Then slowly the Theisic Elder rose and called the vote. The vote passed by the narrowest of margins. 7 systems for open contact, 6 for containment, for abstaining out of what Alina suspected was simple terror of being wrong either way. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't a parade. It was the galaxy, exhausted by 10,000 years of its own fear, choosing barely to find out the truth instead of flinching from it. Alina opened the vault herself 3 days later, with representatives from 6 species watching from a respectful distance, and Meridian running every safeguard the ship possessed, just in case anyone's nerve broke at the last second. Nobody's did. The children woke slowly, blinking up into unfamiliar light, surrounded by faces that belonged to no story they'd ever been told, and reaching instinctively for the adults of the Tantalus's crew who knelt beside each cylinder, repeating the same quiet promise in a dozen variations. "You're safe. You're home. We made it." It wasn't entirely true. Earth was gone. Or at least the Earth they remembered was. The galaxy outside the ship's hull was stranger and larger and far more frightened of them than any of them had braced for. But home had never really meant a planet, not for this crew. It meant the people who'd carried each other through the dark long enough to reach the other side of it. Captain Alina Reyes stood in the vault's doorway and watched her crew rebuild, child by child, the future that the war had nearly erased, and understood with the particular clarity that only 10,000 years of sleep and a lifetime of command could provide, that this was the real victory. Not the battles humanity had won, not the fear they still inspired, but the simple, stubborn fact that despite everything, despite an entire galaxy's worth of myth-making built to bury them, they were still here, still choosing every single day to be something better than the story everyone expected them to become. Outside the Tantalus, in the slow accumulating light of a star that had watched empires rise and fall in humanity's absence, the Ark fleet began quietly to come home. One ship, one signal, one waking crew at a time. The galaxy that had spent 10 millennia treating humanity as a ghost story was about to learn, gradually and on humanity's own terms, that some legends don't end. They just wait for someone brave enough to wake them up. And for the first time in 10,000 years, Alina Reyes allowed herself to believe that what came next might finally be worth staying awake for, and